the 41st millennium, and throughout all history indeed, the brutal orcs have often been underestimated by the other powerful star-faring species in the galaxy. While all have learned to fear the destructive might of the greenskins' migratory crusades, these are seen as temporary events. They sweep across a few star systems before stalling, their tide of advance ebbing and ultimately receding, so that they become little more than a footnote in the history of some other race. However, the war led by Ghazghskull Thraka is different, for this warboss is the most dangerous orc alive. His mighty green crusade is no mere planet crusher, but an invasion that will shake the foundations of the galaxy in a war for total domination. As a species, the orcs are not bound by history. They neither revere the past nor record it in any manner. Greenskins are creatures that live in and for the here and now. What makes the orc whose name is Ghazghskull Mag Uruk Thraka so dangerous is that he has vision, not just for the present, but for the past, and most importantly for the future. After all, he is no mere orc, but rather the living prophet of the orc gods Gork and Mork. Ghazghskull is their mighty instrument of destruction, made manifest. At the close of the 41st millennium, the name of Ghazghskull is spoken in fearful whispers in many alien languages, a name synonymous with dread across the galaxy. It was not always so. The greatest orc warlord in history began his climb to infamy as just another orc warrior, slogging it out on a backwater world. Although he was a fun guy, always. At the very edge of the segmentum solar lies a now frozen orb that was once the sporadically populated orc planet of Urk. Its history has been largely forgotten, buried beneath successive invasions, but it was first named Oroklius, after it was founded by an exploration fleet launched from Terra during the Dark Age of technology. It was part of the Zornian system, and the ties of the warp flowed strongly to that point, making it an excellent hub. Humanity prospered on Oroklius, for it was a world rich in minerals, and within a few hundred Terran years the colonies had grown into thriving cities and busy spaceports. It was undoubtedly the lights and activity that drew the orcs. They swept across Oroklius like wildfire. They razed it to the ground before disappearing aboard their great junk fleet, riding the warp tides to seek other exploits. As is their way, though, the greenskins unwittingly left behind traces of their reproductive fungal spores, and one day they would rise again. Due to the flow of the warp, it was inevitable that spacefaring races would again find the habitable Zornian system. Between barren periods, the world became an Eldari outpost, the home of a cluster of Spindorians and a Hrad warren. At times, the long-dormant orc spores would erupt, and swarms of greenskins would develop in some secretive corner of the planet. It was not until the time of the Great Crusade that the patriarchy of mankind returned again in its great force. It was the Dark Angel Space Marine Legion who cleared the planet of its life forms and again planted the flag of humanity upon it. Once more the planet was dubbed Oroklius. For over 2,000 standard years, humanity mined there, building hive cities and tethering spaceports to its twin moons. Minor Xenos raids occurred, but it wasn't until near the middle of the 32nd millennium that a great greenskin war swept the system in the days of the War of the Beast. It was the largest recorded orc attack upon the Imperium to that time, with dozens of invasions blazing across all 5 segmentums. Soon the Zornian system fell into orc hands, As Heraclius was overwhelmed by greenskins, the last survivors of that world boarded the vast star freighter Dominion and escaped to the suddenly shifting warp. The tides of the warp had altered, making the Zornian system no longer fully accessible. Thus began a long period of stagnation for the orcs. For nearly 8,000 standard years, Heraclius, renamed Urk, was a battleground for warring greenskin tribes, lacking any other race to fight against. At first, they fought over the ruins of the human hive cities, clashing over the best loot of the civilized people's leavings. These battles devolved, as did the piles of plunder that they fought over. As the millennia ground on, the wars continued. No leader proved large enough to gather more than a handful of the tribes or clans beneath him, so an equilibrium of squalor became the way of life. Small orc warbands fought each other for the possession of an ever-dwindling pile of scrap iron and derelict machinery. It was into this bleak cycle of futile violence that Ghazghskull was born. In a curious twist of fate, the Imperium of mankind may have had an unsuspecting hand in creating the most formidable orc of his era, and perhaps of all time. After many Terran years of fighting orcs and monitoring their presence in outlying systems, the Imperium had learned that under the right conditions, even sporadic orc populations could multiply with startling speed. The rise of a strong warlord could unite the feuding clans, triggering a mass release of spores. Should this gathering grow large enough, it could act as a psychic beacon to orcs on nearby planets, drawing them into a swarming migration that built with frightening intensity. In less than a Terran decade, orcs could go from being a minor nuisance to the world's dominant species. The Imperium has found that if a rising war can be detected and countered early enough, the orcs can be broken and dispersed at little cost. Thus, in star systems known to be plagued with greenskins, various watch posts are deployed. In the Zornian system, the Dark Angels had established a range of monitoring stations, coordinated by a command sanctum in a barren, mountainous region of Urk. This hub routinely fed scans and other information back to the nearest Dark Angels vessels. In this way, the greenskin numbers were regularly checked, and the Dark Angels could also keep track of the feral human populations of that star system, for they were always searching for new recruiting planets from which they could draw battle-tested warriors. Ironically, it was this very monitoring station that set Ghazghskull on his journey for greatness. The first mention of Ghazghskull came in some 9 Terran years before the Second War for Armageddon. The stripling warrior Ghazghskull was a trooper in a Goth clan warband that took part in a raid upon the Space Marines' command sanctum. Although it was hidden atop a remote mountain crag on Urk, it was not safe from the orcs. Always seeking a scrap, the greenskins discovered the hidden base and sought to dismantle it, triggering the base's auto-defense system. During the initial rush to claim the base, Ghazghskull was hit in the head by a bolter shell, a shot that pulverized a large section of his cranium and turned a sizable portion of his brain to absolute mush. It was quite possible that the young and profusely bleeding Ghazghskull might have been left for dead then, but for 2 circumstances. Ghazghskull got back to his feet, a sign of toughness and grit that any Goth respected. Also, it was widely known that a particularly addled Tethskull's pain boy was paying those who brought him fresh material to work with. The carrion birds did not feed on Ghazghskull that day, as his own mob guided him onwards. He was a stumbling wreck, and had to hold his bleeding brains in with both hands, but they eventually reached the Deathskull's outpost of Rustspike. There, his own mob traded Ghazghskull to Mad Doc Grotznik for the total sum of 3 teeth and a new chopper. Ghazghskull came out of his haze immediately after Mad Doc Grotznik performed his pivotal operation. That he awoke was a surprise to both parties, for Grotznik had replaced part of the Goth warrior's skull and brain with bionics, wires and squig sinew, holding it all in place by riveting on adamantium plates. Ghazghskull could see more clearly than he had ever before. This had little to do with his eyesight, or new bionic eye, which truthfully was always out of focus. Rather, the first time in his short life, Ghazghskull awoke with a brand new vision. It was his destiny to rally all of orcdom and to lead them on the greatest war of all time. It was now his belief that he was in direct contact with Gork and Mork, the great green gods of the orcs, and Ghazghskull realized that he had been chosen as the living embodiment of their divine wishes. They wanted him to lead the way towards the greatest battles in the galaxy. The first to fall beneath Ghazghskull's iron-shod heel was the Deathskull's warlord Dregmek. Ghazghskull had just emerged from Mad Doc Grotznik's grimy tent, and was still rubbing his shiny adamantium-plated head when Dregmek approached. Striding down the street that ran between the corrugated shacks of the derelict Deathskull's outpost that looked like a shanty town, Dregmek demanded to know what a Goth was doing within the boundaries of Rustspike. Behind Dregmek, his entourage of knobs guffawed, anticipating a bit of sport. Undaunted by the massive, cobbled-together combi weapon that the Deathskull's warlord was waving in his direction, Ghazghskull advanced, knobbly fists engaged. Dregmek, expecting exactly such a move from a Goth, opened fire. Every barrel of his custom weapon began to blaze. The air was filled with flying projectiles, and the flashing of half a dozen gun muzzles emitted blinding strobes of light. Perhaps it was a sign from Gork, or possibly Mork, a stroke of divine intervention to save their profit, as although explosions blossomed at his feet, and bullets stitched patterns alongside him, Ghazghskull advanced, untouched. The only sounds were the last of the spent shells, clattering to the ground, the spinning whir of empty ammunition hoppers, a few desperate trigger clicks, the heavy tread of iron boots, and finally a rusty squeak as Dregmek's iron jaw fell open. So savage was the pummeling that Ghazghskull delivered with his bare hands that Dregmek's knobs cheered despite themselves. The headbutt delivered from Ghazghskull's newly armoured skull finished the job with a resounding clang. Straddling the pulped body of his foe, Ghazghskull announced that this was only the beginning. He bellowed to the gaping onlookers that he was the prophet of Gork and Mork, and furthermore his bull voice roared that if anyone was looking for some of the devastation that he had just delivered to their former warlord, then they could step up one at a time or rush altogether, for he cared not. After another hour of solid fighting, a battle in which Ghazghskull did not himself take any more damage than a scratch, he had taken over as rightful ruler of Rustspike. Though it was hard to see much with their bruised and battered faces, it seemed to his new followers that Ghazghskull grew larger before their eyes. By crushing the tribes within reach of his new stronghold, Ghazghskull began to increase his horde. In addition to the death skulls that had followed Dregmek, there were now several goth mobs beneath the young warlord, as tales of Ghazghskull's deeds circulated through the scrap-heap villages and makeshift fortresses of orcs began to leave their tribes and head to Rustspike, looking to be part of something bigger than their own dismal warbands, fighting over the same old scrap. They wished to go to war with this new boss, who claimed to talk to Gork and Mork, who asserted that one day they would find richer targets. Soon Rustspike grew so overcrowded that it was impossible to spit and hit the ground, so Ghazghskull went west. It was on the cracked plains of the Big Wasteland that Ghazghskull met his first setback. He had entered the territory of the Bad Moons, the biggest and most envied of the local clans. The Bad Moon leader was warboss Snazdaka, and none could match the mix of firepower and mobility that his bright yellow battle wagon brigade dealt out. When Snazdaka saw Ghazghskull's forces marching across his lands, he ordered his totem pole raised, his tents collapsed, and faster than a runt herd could throttle a wayward grot, the tribe was on the move. In the running skirmishes that followed, Snazdaka and his boys were always able to lob a few shells onto Ghazghskull's hordes before driving out of range of retaliation. Ghazghskull had already proven his superior brawling skills by overpowering, bludgeoning, and working over all who dared challenge or defy him. Now, however, he was engaged in a battle of wits and tactics. Here, too, the up-and-coming warlord would display not just his superiority, but the kind of brutal showmanship that makes orcs punch their fists into the air and raise raucous cheers. Within days, Ghazghskull unleashed a number of countermeasures, any one of which would have proved too much for the Bad Moons to overcome, and would have impressed any orc with its moderate intelligence. He had his lads sabotage the supply dumps, where Snazdaka refueled his wagons. Ghazghskull then gauged the wind and ordered several shanty towns put to flame. The thick, acrid smoke drifted over the cracked plains, hiding the exact whereabouts of his troops' movements, and making it impossible for the Bad Moons to flee until Ghazghskull's infantry was right up upon them. Most impressively, Ghazghskull had coerced the fastest orc on Urk to join him by outracing him in a one-on-one duel of speed. All who saw it agreed that only the divine might of Gork and Mork could have allowed the now hulking Goth warlord to outpace the grand speed boss, Shazfrag of the Evil Sons. Each and every one of Ghazghskull's tactics worked, bearing down the Bad Moons and wearing them so that their defeat was inevitable. As the humbled Snazdaka watched, Ghazghskull ordered the Bad Moon mechs to fashion an enormous power claw from the rubble of their ruined tanks. So did all the Bad Moons on the planet fall into line, one by one. So large had Ghazghskull's horde grown that no warband on Urk could hope to stand before his sweeping onslaught. Only the foolish or stubborn even attempted to stand apart from the meteoric rise of this great greenskin champion. One such stubborn fool was snakebite warboss Grudbolg. It took a long, bloody solar week to subdue the snakebites under Grudbolg, and Ghazghskull was forced to decapitate the scarred old monster twice before finally winning his loyalty. When challenged to a headbutting contest by the hulking Goth champion Ugrak, Ghazghskull was like a pile driver, sinking his foe a full foot into the ground and knocking him unconscious. Ugrag's Nobs mob were so stunned that their undefeated leader had lost that they did not see Ghazghskull striding towards them. In a fury, Ghazghskull worked his way through the Nobs, leaving each senseless. When the heads of Ugrag and his Nobs finally cleared, they quite sensibly pledged eternal allegiance to Ghazghskull. Battles of attrition had raged across the surface of Urk for nearly 8,000 Terran years, with small tribes continually rising and falling, each time battering themselves and those around them into submission, wearing themselves out, overstretching. No great leader had ever emerged from the endless cycle over all that time. None could rise above and unite the tribes, until now. It took 6 standard years for Ghazghskull to fully subjugate Urk. Now grown larger than any warlord ever seen on the planet, he basked in his dominion. Inspired by the spirits of the rising War and Ghazghskull's impassioned speeches about conquering the stars, the orcs swarmed about the planet's surface in a flurry of activity. A smattering of ramshackle void ships began to arrive as orcs from across the Zornian system felt the siren call of a war and hastened to join. For the first time, groups of mechs worked together, building in ways never contemplated before. Never before had they been able to access and mass their squalid resources, but now all of the scrap heaps were as one. Crazed energies flowed as they cobbled together vast battle fortresses, new weapons and towering engines of destruction. All of Urk's greenskins moved with a sense of destiny, an overwhelming realization of their duty, their very purpose for being. And then the sun flickered. All of the greenskins looked up at the suddenly dimmed sun that had always lit the planet of Urk. All save Ghazghskull himself were cowed. The superstitious orcs dropped their weapons and spanners and stared upwards, slack-jawed in the wonder at the celestial phenomenon. The sun flared, blazed, and once more its rays blinked. In his booming voice, Ghazghskull assured the quavering greenskins that this was a sign from Gork and Mork. It was telling them that it was time to leave Urk behind, that it was time for the galaxy to feel the might of the growing War. Even as the warlord spoke, a lone beam of green-tinted light illuminated the prophet of the great green gods. He told his followers to stockpile all of the arms and ammunition they could, for they were leaving within the week. As there were few operating aircraft on Urk, and the mechs had only just started to construct more, some greenskins wondered how this might happen. A single glare from Ghazghskull, however, was enough to silence their questions and instill in them, if not confidence, then at least a fear of asking how any such thing might be accomplished. The next day brought no dawn. In this case, however, it was nothing to do with the strange behavior of Urk's sun. The warp currents had changed again, reverting to patterns similar of those of ages ago. As the tides of the warp roiled and twisted, they had also deposited an enormous space hulk into real space, vomiting forth the conglomerate voidcraft in the Zornian system. The hulk now drifted in Urk's orbit, blocking out the light from the flickering sun. As solar flares and radiation storms wafted from Urk's tortured sun, Ghazghskull turned to his mechs and bade them to secure the Space Hulk using super-heavy tractor cannons. A few of the available spacecraft were equipped with harpoon rockets, and they fired these off to tether the colossal Space Hulk to one of Urk's twin moons. For the moment, the Space Hulk was pinned, but they all knew it would not be for long. Under Ghazghskull's orders, the remaining orcs rushed to assist the mechs. They worked non-stop to craft as many crude transport ships as they could. There were perhaps 100 constructions, worthy of being called ships, while other craft were built to complete only a single journey. There were many hundreds of these crude rockets, each incapable of being steered, each with orcs and equipment wedged into every hole and crawl space. Boarding the largest of this crude fleet, Ghazghskull led the great exodus from the planet to seize the Space Hulk. With exhaust flashes and more than their share of premature detonations and mid-air collisions, the departing voidcraft filled the sky. Some ships struck the Space Hulk's outer decks and detonated to blow gaping holes into the superstructure. A few rockets ploughed deep into the Hulk to deposit their orc cargo, while the most sturdily connected ships usually had the wherewithal to fly about the vast Space Hulk to seek out landing sites, or at least to enter the vast Hulk through the massive holes blown into it by less fortunate orc rockets. Alas, as so often the case, the Space Hulk was not unoccupied. As soon as the first wave of orcs landed, they were attacked by demonic entities, burner boys cutting their way through bulkheads, had to suddenly shift from slicing metal to defending themselves against a tide of demons. Gouts of dirty orange flame were met in kind by arcane blue jets, as the burner boys traded scorching death with prancing pink horrors. Before their ships had even settled, speed freaks launched themselves from cargo ramps, racing down cavernous corridors, guns blazing. Less than half of the orc spacecraft were able to lift off once again, but these disengaged in order to go back to Urk's surface to ferry more greenskins into the battle. The fighting took solar weeks, during which time billions of greenskins were airlifted off Urk to join the fray. Ghazghskull himself led the spearhead that fought its way to the center of the Space Hulk. There, at the black heart of the jumbled amalgamation, was an ancient voidcraft, none other than the vast star freighter Dominion. After leaving Urk, then called Herocleus, to escape the orc attack, the voidcraft became lost in the warp, its terrified human cargo attracting the horrific creatures that dwelled there. The Dominion had returned home, but where its warp engines had once been located, there was now a huge warp rift, a darksome hole from which the energies of the Immaterium poured forth. The fight to take over the demon-held Space Hulk was a bitter battle through the ever-changing confines. Neither side showed mercy, hacking at each other in the narrow corridors and turning vast cargo bays into slaughter pits where entire armies crashed headlong. Now and again, newcomers would join the fight, a fresh tide of demons sweeping from the Space Hulk's center, or an orc rocket crashing through to deliver its living payload. Slowly, the orcs drove the demon host back, but at every junction lay an ambush, and casualties were high. It was Mad Doc Grotznik who led a charge to win the landing bays of what must have been an old imperial transport. The landing craft berthed within was still occupied by the skeletons of their long-dead pilots. The few landing craft that were still operational were commandeered to aid the transport efforts. It was Ugrak's Uglies, the Goth Knobs mob, that fought their way to the asteroid embedded deep within the Space Hulk. There, in magma-worn tunnels, they pitted power claws against hellblades, and in the end only Ugrak's combi Scorcher swept the path clear. In the larger holds, battle wagons lowered their death rollers to smash all opposition, before being countered by soul grinders, hulking demon engines whose metal claws shredded the orc vehicles. Soon, orc tank busters were hunting the soul grinders, crawling through air vents to send rockets corkscrewing onto their unnatural foes, blowing them apart in sprays of flame and ichor. Behind the front waves of fighting came the mechs, welding over patches, resealing airlocks, and repairing their battered engines of war. Having driven the demonic hosts before him, Ghazghskull ordered the massed firepower of his entourage to be turned against the tear in reality. To his frustration, this did nothing to it. With the bestial roar and leaking raw green energy from his reconstructed skull, Ghazghskull charged the rent. To further anger the warlord, his power claw proved equally ineffectual, and with an alarming challenge, Ghazghskull unleashed the full thunder of his best headbutt. There was a flash of green, an audible pop, and at last the rift collapsed upon itself. Whether it was the force of that last blow, or the latent psychic energy within Ghazghskull himself, it was done, and the demon threat ended, at least for a time. The Space Hulk, which Ghazghskull named World Killer, was now in orc control. Just as superheated gas clouds swept over Urk, World Killer shifted back into the warp. How long Ghazghskull and his followers drifted in the warp is not known. Time passes strangely there, and orcs keep no records. They explored the bounds of the vast space hulk, finding strange technology, ancient machines from humanity's lost past, and other apparatus beyond their comprehension. For some, especially the Deathskulls, this meandering search included nicking everything not bolted down. As they worked alongside burner boys whose arc welders cut through metal, the orcs were able to appropriate anything, no matter how well fastened it was, to the rest of the ship. On Ghazghskull's command, many mechs began working on a force field projector. Meanwhile, competing warbands fought to gather scrap, and minor wars broke out over salvage rights to different piles of loot and rubble. This rivalry kept tensions at just the right level to prevent the volatile orcs from growing too bored. Sheets of iron decking were reworked into battle wagons, used to plate up stompers, or beaten into crude body armor to outfit knobs. In the mad furor to reclaim metal, several warbands were swept into the warp when they overstretched their boundaries and cut away sections of the Space Hulk's outermost walls. It was this kind of foolishness that allowed warp entities to re-enter World Killer. Several more demonic incursions plagued the journey, and Ghazghskull had to drive out the worst of these warp offences personally. With vicious battles breaking out across the Space Hulk, there was an abundance of violent war energy, and the orcs thrived and multiplied. Soon, every cranny of the void craft was bursting with more greenskins. Everywhere the swarms of grots scurried. The halls rang to the sound of chants, shooter blasts, and the commands of the ever-busy mechs. Gradually the demon tides ebbed. The jubilant orcs were beginning to get restless, when sudden jolts alerted all that the lumbering Space Hulk was slowing down. With gut-lurching suddenness, World Killer ripped back into real space. What had been an empty void was now filled with the massive Space Hulk. Aboard the sprawling vessel, klaxons blared, and Ghazghskull's voice boomed out of speakers and down corridors all over the ship, telling all to prepare for battle. Like a tidal wave, the momentum of World Killer sent the Space Hulk crashing forward. It smashed aside defense stations, while panicked picket ships accelerated to get out of the path of the hurtling wall of space junk. The orcs emerged at the edge of a star system vital to the Imperium, heading straight for the core planet. Before them sprawled the immensity that was Armageddon, an industrial giant of mankind's realm. The planet lay roughly 10,000 light-years to the galactic northeast of Terra in the Segmentum Solar. It was a vital node of navigational channels, and its countless manufactoriums supplied munitions to Astra Militarum regiments throughout the Armageddon sector and beyond. No force in the galaxy could now stop World Killer from crash landing onto Armageddon. Guided by his visions, Ghazghskull did not wish to halt his flight. Rather, he welcomed the headlong plunge towards the world below. The acceleration built, and he bellowed joyous war cries as the hull blazed with fire, and the Hulk thundered down from Armageddon's sky like a scrap iron avalanche. Up until this point, Ghazghskull had only made a name for himself on Urk, a little-known and soon-to-be-dead star system. Soon, however, his name would send ripples of fear across hundreds of thousands of worlds. Now Ghazghskull was on a collision course with greatness. Surrounding Imperial fleets, long-ranged missiles and the planet's orbital defense lasers did their best to stave off the inevitable. Their firepower managed to shear away a few chunks of the oncoming Space Hulk, but they could not stop the terminal dive of World Killer, nor could they alter its course. Although shorn of a good deal of its mass by the desperate salvos, the enormous Space Hulk plunged through Armageddon's polluted atmosphere to crash land upon its largest continent, Armageddon Prime. The deep impact of the landing shook the entire world, and its vast blast wave caused untold devastation. A cloud of debris shrouded the sun. Hundreds of thousands of orcs were instantly immolated by the cataclysmic contact of the landing. Their losses, however, were but a tiny fraction of their number. As the shock faded, a few of the orcs realized that they should have died in that epic crash. Ghazghskull claimed it was the protection of the gods, although the force field projector absorbing the brunt of that impact doubtlessly helped. Regardless, the orcs roared their approval at staying alive after the exhilarating ride. Eager to release their pent-up aggression, they poured out of drop ramps or simply blasted new exit holes through the already torn and rent ruins of the remaining hulls. Ghazghskull divided his followers up into 5 distinct hordes, each under one of his most powerful warlords. These were leaders Ghazghskull had subdued upon Urk, ferocious orcs that had learned by fighting alongside him. Under the dust storm's darkness, the towering War Overlord pointed out the direction each of his sub-commanders should take. With a wave of his power claw, Ghazghskull launched endless columns of orc war machines and living seas of green-skinned infantry. With one voice, many millions bellowed. The defenders of Armageddon were not ready for what hit them. The Astra Militarum and the planetary defense forces of Armageddon may have been well equipped, but they were wholly unprepared for the waves of violence that swept over their armies. It was clear that the humans underestimated the strategic ability of their foes. They had fought orcs before, but those greenskins were different. This was not some petty warlord's formulaic assault. This was Ghazghskull. Although none of his sub-commanders displayed the sheer audacity and cunning of their master, Ghazghskull had physically beaten enough into their skulls about tactics for some of it to stick. They easily overwhelmed the planetary defense force legions that advanced out of the planet's hive cities to contain them. First, the orcs launched assaults to pin their foe in place on the flat ash wastes, while biker mobs and battle wagon brigades raced around to encircle their foes, cutting them off their supply lines. Then the greenskins tightened the noose. They set up their mech gun batteries to pummel the panicked defenders left in the ever-shrinking cauldron. Desperate attempts to break out were met by gun lines. Mercilessly, the orcs mowed down anything that moved, guffawing at the lines of umis that advanced to meet only death, aping their final curses as they twitched their last upon the blood-stained ash. With the plains cleared, the orcs advanced on the hive cities, and there they were astounded. Built atop sprawling, ash-blown desert wastes, the hives rose up taller than mountains. These were the great factory cities of the Imperium, the lifeblood of its non-stop war efforts. This was industrial might on a scale never before seen by orcs. The mechs gazed at the hives with joy, imagining how they could repurpose such works, what they could build with such colossal hordes of materiel of this more civilized race. The Imperium's defense of the hives proved more formidable. The Astra Militarim's numbers were augmented by every regiment available, along with hastily armed citizens. A long series of trenches and redoubts encircled each vast walled complex. Ghazghskull took one look at Hive Vulcanus before vowing boldly that it would fall in 2 solar days' time. Although his hordes were numerous enough to overwhelm the gates, Ghazghskull did not want to waste his strength. He had yet to unleash the full terror of his gargant big mobs, but he thought the prodigious firepower would be saved for when it was truly required. Instead, his plan to take out the enormous factory city reflected his cunning. It was simple. It just needed flawless execution and seamless cooperation. A tall order for a typical war leader, but not so for Ghazghskull. The outer barriers were targeted by blitz brigades, armoured wedges of battle wagons. The first wave bore rams, and it was their duty to break open the outer walls, using their tracks to carry them over the rubble. The second group of attackers followed in the wake of the smoke-churning battle wagons. These were the mobile infantry, mostly goth boys, with mobs of burner boys amongst them. The third wave was composed of scorchers. Their orders were to dive through the breaches and to clear any defences with sweeping flame. Tractor beams would target the gates as the battle wagons cleared the last trench. Timed correctly, the loaded wagons would be at top speed just as the doors were ripped off their hinges. Secondary plans included a Storm Boys airdrop and stompers with wrecking balls opening up holes at strategic points. When the waves of infantry were finally released, they would enter Vulcanus at will. The plan worked almost too well. The hive would have fallen in a single solar day were it not for its fierce resistance. Within the narrow confines of the hive's underways, desperate humans resorted to all manner of traps and ambushes. Despite their heroics, hundreds of thousands of orcs swept into Hive Vulcanus, and its population was massacred or enslaved. After Hive Vulcanus was captured, the remaining hives of Armageddon and Prime soon followed. Columns of human refugees stretched past the horizon. All of Armageddon Prime lay under the massive metal heel of Ghazghskull. What were once manufactoria were converted into workshops, swarming with orcs recycling the human technology into weirder and wackier inventions. Human slaves were worked to death, stripping their own cities of every scrap of resource that the mechs could use to fuel the greenskin war machine. The war proceeded southwards towards the heavily populated contingent of Armageddon Secundus. Being somewhat soft, it is extraordinary for Umis to gain respect from orcs, especially greenskins led by a stoic and battle-hungry Goth like Ghazghskull. Although Space Marines are regarded with esteem for their skills in battle, none more so than the Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, it was an Imperial Commissar that drew the most admiration from the orcs. There was an uncompromising warrior there, as eager to shoot his own lads as the foe, if that's what it took to gain victory. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick was certainly a thorn in Ghazghskull's side, for the greenskins reckoned that it was he alone that willed the defenders of Hades' hive to hold on for so long. The orcs gradually learned from their captives that the defenders of Hades had grown to fear Yarrick as much as they dreaded the fury of Ghazghskull. To the orcs, this was the kind of leader that they could respect. The fact he wore Goth colours, the black and red trim of his uniform, boosted his esteem even further. It was said that of all Ghazghskull's foes, Yarrick was the one that he never cursed. High praise, indeed, instead. Those orcs that came face to face with the infamous Umi boss often expressed disappointment. In person, Yarrick was only human size, although this was lessened somewhat because he did at least wear an orc power claw and bear an evil eye to compensate. Amongst the boys, it was said that those orcs that recognized who they were up against were always slain, for they stood in gape-jawed disbelief at Yarrick's insulting puniness, and so left themselves open to a death blow. The wily orcs acknowledged the value of this tactic, even if it was a sly, sneaky blood-axe kind of trick, and didn't make up for pure size, which was always respected the most by the orcs. When Armageddon's season of shadows set in, the cyclical time when the planet's volcanic mountains erupted, the turbulent skies were permanently crimson-hued. To the orcs, this was another sign of their impending victory. To get to Armageddon Secundus, the orcs had to cross a swathe of equatorial jungle, considered impenetrable by the humans. The fetid swamp region was a morass of mud pits that would submerge armies at a time, and it was filled with ferocious wild beasts. The greenskins revelled in it, attacking the flora and fauna, while the mechs erected pontoon bridges or projected force fields across the stinking bogs. By their drive and cobbled ingenuity, the orc hordes pressed through faster than imperial armies could match. Infantry, armoured columns, stomper mobs and towering gargants crossed the crude bridges and emerged on the far side of the jungles. Once again the orcs caught the humans unprepared and smashed through their defensive positions, hastily erected. As the orcs raced across the ash deserts towards the hive cities, the towering god engines and tank companies of mankind advanced out onto the barrens to meet them. From that point on, the battles were more fiercely fought, and orc casualties began to mount. First was the clash on the parched desert known as the Death Barrens. While the colossal war engine of the Iron Skull's Titan Legion duelled with the Gargants, the mass enemy tanks began to blow great holes in the orc hordes. The greenskins did not waver, but continued to advance, albeit more slowly, into that thunderous barrage. The energies of the war might have been drained then, if it were not for the dread mobs, Clanking forward, these iron-plated tank killers strode through the shell storm. A land armada of death dreads, killer cans, and hulking Morkanons launched into the enemy armor formations. Explosions lit up the plains as power claws wrenched off turrets. Buzzsaw arms reached in to savage the exposed crew, and the screams of the eviscerated victims were music to the orcs' ears. With the foe's tanks reduced to smoking wreckage, the Stompers and Death Dreads used their firepower to tip the scales on the evenly matched duel between the Gargants and the Titans. Towering mushroom clouds rose from the destroyed Imperial Titans, and the concussive blasts of their detonations slew many orcs. But when the shock waves ceased, the green tide flowed over the enormous craters, onwards. The sieges that followed brought the Armageddon War to a new state of savagery. By now, the humans knew what lay in store for them, and their resistance stiffened. The orcs sacked Infernus Hive after the Blood Axes struck a deal with its corrupt governor, but they could not break through the great hive cities of Hades or Hell's Reach. In desperation, the Imperial side launched virus bombs, wicked and prescribed technology from their distant past. Hundreds of thousands of orcs died, but still they pressed on, battering themselves against the hive cities for little gain. With his sub-commanders flummoxed on how to break through, Ghazghskull was forced to direct the assaults personally himself. Ghazghskull tried many ploys: lightning assaults, feints, overwhelming wave attacks, and massed bombardments. Air-dropped storm boys attacked from the skies, while the sewer tunnels were infiltrated by the craftiest commandos he could find. At Hell's Reach, these stratagems paid off, each offensive advancing more deeply into that seaport hive city. With the streets red with blood, Ghazghskull's final tactic to gather the weird boys together so that their war-addled minds blasted forth a psychic storm worked perfectly. Paralyzed by madness, the defenders were overrun. In Hades, however, each of Ghazghskull's moves was parried. The Storm Boys were ripped from the skies by anti-aircraft fire. The commandos were met by tunnel fighters in a running battle that stymied the underground advance. Siege engines were sabotaged, and human suicide teams took down the Gargants. The defense of Hades' hive was masterminded by Commissar Yarrick, who was destined to become the most respected Yumi that Ghazghskull ever met. As Ghazghskull fixated on tearing Hades' hive apart, on his command another orc army was set to overwhelm the hive city of Acheron. But that was before the sky exploded. Orbital bombardment blasted craters amongst the orc hordes. Even as they gaped skyward, they saw thunderhawks peel out of the cloud cover, the roar of their engines audible over the concussive shockwave of their bombing runs. The Space Marines, the finest warriors in the Emperor's service, had arrived. The Blood Angels, the Ultramarines, and the Salamanders attacked. And the orcs tasted the bitterness of crushing defeat for the first time. At that moment, if Ghazghskull had turned his attention to the deteriorating situation, it was likely that he would have rallied his armies and driven off the Space Marine counterattack. Had he done so, Armageddon would likely have fallen. However, the completion of the siege of Hades' hive had become an obsession for him. Prophet though he was, in the red haze of battle, Ghazghskull no longer heard any calling save to grind his own iron boots upon those who had dared defy him. Finally, Ghazghskull's own bully boys broke down the last blast door. With the inner gates now blown open, Ghazghskull threw everything at the hive city, unleashing his final rampage. The Space Marines arrived too late to save Hades' hive, and those inside were massacred nearly to a man. With his numbers depleted and widely scattered, Ghazghskull commanded the last of his reinforcements to besiege Tartarus' hive. The fate of the planet hung in the balance, but the Space Marines were quick to redeploy. A drop pod assault struck the orcs, even as Gorkanauts and Stompers smashed down the hive's gates. Blindsided again, the greenskins were pushed back and on the verge of breaking when Ghazghskull arrived. His counterattack was beginning to wrest the initiative back when Ghazghskull and his bodyguard disappeared altogether. Rumours that their illustrious warboss had fallen spread like wildfire amongst the orcs, and they wavered and broke. With this, the Imperium thought that they had driven the orcs from Armageddon. It was not so. Many had fought their way into the ash wastes and escaped, eventually reaching the depths of the equatorial jungles. Moreover, Ghazghskull was not slain. Some say that the hand of Gork reached down to extricate his chosen one. Ghazghskull's few orc detractors claimed that he had fled, but however it happened, the warboss escaped off-planet. All I know for certain is that I won't say he fled, because I like to be safe.
Pantadin.